As I've mentioned numerous times in my videos the past couple weeks, I've been trying to do a sizable amount of research on bipolar disorder and see how it may or may not correlate with dyspraxia. On top of this, it's the holidays, so it's busy as hell at work. So I'm sorry this video took as long as it did to get out, but keep in mind that even as much research as I've done, this video is not a replacement for any sort of medical diagnosis. The only person who can diagnose you with any disorder, whether it be dyspraxia, bipolar, or otherwise, is a licensed, well-informed medical professional. And I can't underline this enough when it comes to bipolar disorder, because even after reading all the papers and all the shit that I've been reading, I still can't decide whether or not there is a sizable correlation between bipolar disorder and dyspraxia. You see, the thing is, most of the people I personally know who have been diagnosed with both were diagnosed at a time when dyspraxia was still considered a part of the autism spectrum. So our whole knowledge of how neurodevelopmental disorders work and everything was still relatively flawed. And we still have somewhat of a poor understanding of our brain today. We really don't understand how consciousness works still. But one thing I did notice is that a lot of the symptoms of bipolar disorder seem to be a lot similar to the symptoms of ADHD and to some extent dyspraxia. And I can see how some clinician, especially if they're unaware or not entirely knowledgeable of dyspraxia or how it affects the brain and emotions and everything, would come to the conclusion that there's bipolar disorder involved as well. This video was really hard to make because there's not a whole lot of public actual knowledge about how bipolar actually works, because a lot of people use bipolar flippantly as just kind of a casual term for someone who switches emotions quickly, when typically most people aren't actually bipolar. Bipolar disorder is usually defined as having at least one really long, extended period of clinical depression. And I've talked about it in that video. And it's almost immediately followed by a long period of mania. I'm gonna get on mania in a bit, but just keep that in mind. And these periods aren't just like a little bit of depression and then automatically someone's happy again. These are severely long periods. You have to keep in mind that in general, most individuals do change moods somewhat frequently depending on certain stimulus. And if you are dyspraxic or have another neurodevelopmental disorder and are more prone to emotional changes, then yes, you're going to feel those emotions significantly heavier. But bipolar disorder is something almost completely different entirely. And what most people put the focus on when they're thinking of bipolar disorder is the quick change in mood. But that's not how it works at all. In fact, just about everybody kind of does this. And if you are having really frequent mood swings, that's usually the sign of a completely different disorder usually. Bipolar disorder is long periods of depression, almost soon after followed by long periods of mania. And by mania, I'm not talking about the annual event Vince McMahon runs to show everyone just how much of a monopoly he had on the wrestling business for decades. I'm talking about clinical level mania, or what is usually considered a manic state. And this is why bipolar disorder used to be called manic depressive disorder or manic depression. Mania is kind of the opposite of depression, hence why the disorder is called bipolar disorder, because they're polar opposites. And so while depression is a severe lack of motivation, mania is kind of the opposite. And while that may seem like a good thing, and in many cases can be a good thing, especially when it comes to creativity or being willing to take risks, it's that last part where the real danger of bipolar disorder comes, and where a lot of the social stigma behind bipolar disorder comes from. The overall effects of a manic state brought on by bipolar disorder can typically be comparable to that of, extreme stimulant usage when it comes to recreational drug use. And so feelings of delusions of grandeur, as well as feelings of invincibility, impulsivity, and the enhanced creativity as well, are notable in manic states. And so when you're going from depression to mania on a consistent basis, this is where they usually come to the conclusion of bipolar disorder. And again, after watching this video, you may be terribly convinced that you have bipolar disorder. Many people are, especially when they look back at their life and they start reading on these topics. But there's something really important here, and it's something that if you ever choose to research bipolar disorder, you'll see is this graph here. Typically, most people do suffer some semblance of what many people would consider a bipolar disorder, but the periods aren't as extreme or as long as someone with bipolar disorder. And as you see from that graph, there are multiple kinds of bipolar disorder. So, it's kind of on a spectrum like autism. Although it's less like autism and more like diabetes in that sense, because it's not really like the gradients are shifted. It's more like a completely different mechanism of action. And if you did watch my last few videos, especially the one on depression that I referenced in the beginning of this video, you could see how dyspraxia would play its role in making someone feel like they're bipolar. Especially because of the notable lag between when we actually receive stimulus and when we actually feel it. And so because of that, we may be upset about something that happened like a week ago simply because it took us that long to actually finally feel that emotion. And, well, I've touched on this in a video too. It's also important to remember that as part of the differential diagnosis, or what your psychiatrist will try to rule out before deciding if you have bipolar disorder, one of the things they rule out is ADHD, because ADHD is known for its hyperactivity, impulsivity, and that's commonly seen in manic states as well as long periods of depression because ADHD. And so because many dyspraxics, I think it's estimated 50%, are shown to have ADHD, it could be easy to see some correlation there, especially with individuals who were diagnosed before ADHD was as common a diagnosis as it is. And so they may have gone to see a psychiatrist a couple decades ago even, and they may have said, okay, maybe you have dyspraxia, or maybe you have autism, clumsy child syndrome, whatever. And on top of that, it looks like you're bipolar when you may or may not have actually had ADHD instead. It is important to note that I'm not saying that it's not possible that someone could be bipolar and have dyspraxia. In fact, I'd say it is relatively probable, especially because there may be some correlation between the two. And due to environmental factors and just the variance in human brain chemistry, it's really hard to say or generalize whether or not one disorder is related to another or not, because people are unique and brain chemistry is bizarrely unique and complex. And so it's really hard to make a decision on psychology or psychiatry in the general speaking, because people are just so varied. But if I were to make my best guess, most of the people I know who do have bipolar disorder alongside dyspraxia typically seem to be more ADHD leaning than bipolar leaning. And it's also important to remember that dyspraxia also does have correlation with various personality disorders that also show traits of bipolar disorder. Personality disorders are a whole video in itself entirely, but one of the more common ones seen alongside dyspraxia is borderline personality disorder. And while there's a ridiculous amount of complexity that goes into defining that, just like with bipolar disorder, there are some significant similarities. Same with dependent personality disorder, which is also seen alongside dyspraxia commonly. I also know many of my subscribers do also consume or at least experiment with other recreational substances. So it's also important to remember that many of the effects that look like bipolar can also be side effects of both withdrawal or just the key effects of whatever substance they're taking, whether it be intentional or otherwise. And again, I can't stress this enough. This is all taken from the small amount of research I was able to get while also working retail during the holiday season. So this video is not a replacement for a medical diagnosis or medical training or any sort of medical knowledge. This is just one of my usual opinionated videos on a psychological or psychiatric topic from my point of view. And this isn't something I have firsthand personal experience with, like dyspraxia, because I've never been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And I know this video is probably shorter than most of my videos, but again, this is a topic that I'm not really too close with or too connected to, so I can't really give too many personal anecdotes personally. But if after watching this video you do think that you may or may not have bipolar disorder, it's important to see a licensed medical professional. You cannot self-diagnose yourself. And if your medical opinion of bipolar disorder comes from Mean Girls or Desperate Housewives, and you think you're bipolar, 9 times out of 10, you're not. But that's all for this video, everyone. I know it's been shorter than my usual ones, and it's not as in-depth, and I'm sorry for that, guys, but should have a new video out next week, assuming the holidays don't kill me too hard. And yeah, that's all for this one, everyone. You guys have a good one.